Croeso hynnes iawn I chi gyd. Diolch am ddod. I'm Kathy Stromer. I'm the Programme Manager for Researcher Development at the Learned Society of Wales. For those of you who aren't aware, the Learned Society of Wales Early Career Researcher Network is aimed at anyone who is starting or recently started a career in research or working with researchers. Most members are working in higher education, but the network is also open for those in the public, private, and third sectors. At the moment, we've got several opportunities for researchers to get involved with our work, including our interdisciplinary seminars like this one, but also skills workshops and a conference which are coming up. We'd love to get you involved, so please let us know if you'd like to contribute. This is a pan-Wales and cross-disciplinary network. That means members have the opportunity to connect with those beyond their institution, and of course, connect with the broad expertise and experience of our fellows. I'm very, very excited about today's session. The topic, bringing policy into research, is central to researchers' work. It provides a pathway to develop significant impact across different sectors. But the question is how to approach policymakers. One aim today is to provide tips and resources to be able to do this. We're delighted to have excellent speakers to deliver the event, an officer from the Welsh Parliament and 3 members of our ECR network, together with one of our fellows, Roger Anwen Scully, who will be chairing. Professor Anwen Scully is the chair of Political Studies Association of the UK. Since 2021, he's also been Professor of Political Science at Hong Kong Baptist University, and he is joining us from Hong Kong this morning. He was previously head of politics and international relations at Cardiff University. Lastly, in 2019, he was named University Mentor of the Year at the National Mentoring Awards. So, croeso I chi, Professor Anwen Scully. Diolch am ddod.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Kathy, and good morning to you all, bod I chi gyd. And Kathy has already ably described the main purposes of this session today. It's going to be, so broadly speaking, a session in 2 halves. The first and slightly shorter half, we're going to be hearing from Hannah Johnson from the Welsh Parliament, and then later we'll be hearing from some active researchers about their experiences. But this first part is, as I said, where we have Hannah Johnson from Welsh Parliament, Senedd Cymru. Hannah leads the Knowledge Exchange Programme at Senedd Cymru, and she has more than 12 years of experience in parliamentary research around the world, specialising in equality and human rights. She provides advice at an international level for a number of parliaments and democracy support programmes, including for the United Nations and the European Union. Hannah has an LLM in human rights law and also writes about human rights issues as a freelance journalist in her spare time, alongside running a community arts website. I'm not quite sure where she gets this spare time, but anyway, that's about what she does. So Hannah, it's fantastic to have you joining us all this morning. And so Hannah is going to speak for a while, about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have some opportunity for Q&A after her presentation. So Hannah, I'll hand things over to you now.
Thanks so much, Roger, and thanks for having me this morning. It's really good to be here in a group of intimidatingly clever people. I can see all of the introductions in the chat, and I feel very humbled by all of that. I'm just going to share my screen, and I hope someone can give me a nod to see if that is up. Roger's nodding furiously from Hong Kong, so that's fantastic. So as Roger said, I've worked in parliamentary research in Wales and in various other parliaments for over 12 years. And I currently lead the Sened's Knowledge Exchange Programme, which means that I work with researchers from Wales and the UK and beyond to broaden, deepen and diversify the evidence that's used to inform democratic debate in Wales. And today I'll be taking you on a very quick journey through the policy landscape in Wales and giving you some practical tips for engaging. If you have any questions, please add them into the chat. And if you want to chip in on anything, please use that. So I think I'll start off with these two quotes on the screen, which may or may not be familiar to you. These are both quotes from politicians in the UK over the last few years. And I think they demonstrate that the experts and decision makers often have quite a difficult relationship and find it quite hard to navigate each other's worlds. But I think that we all hopefully instinctively know that good decisions rely on good evidence. And the past few years of the pandemic has really thrown this relationship into sharp relief. And during this time, decisions were really led by evidence, scientific evidence like never before. But I think we all know that we don't live in this lovely, straightforward world where a problem is clearly identified, evidence is gathered comprehensively and scientifically, a solution is designed fairly based on the evidence, which leads to the problem being solved in a measurable and fair way. Decision making is really messy. And my notes for this slide, whenever I do this presentation, just say sausages. And it's because, have you ever heard that quote that laws are like sausages? It's better not to see either of them being made. And I think I would agree with that particular sentiment, because there are so many factors that influence how a problem is prioritized and defined, what evidence is selected and how it's used, the solution that's chosen and how it's designed, and how the outcome is measured and for whom. But I think some of the main factors that do influence decision making are research, experiences, and politics. And I really see Parliament as being at the intersection of these three things. And I know I would say that because I love Parliament. I worked in Parliament for a long time. But the research side comes in many different forms, from academics, from civil society, from think tanks, and it's of varying rigor and quality. But a lot of weight is put on academic research, even if it doesn't always feel like it. Decision makers rely on people like yourselves to create independent research that informs the design of policies, laws, and programs. The experience side often comes from citizens or constituents, and sometimes the personal experience of politicians and decision makers too. And I think we can all think of politicians in particular that have spearheaded programs because of their own personal experiences. And I think politics is the least controllable and definable factor, as it's all about power and often happens behind closed doors. It's influenced by relationships, personal beliefs, ambitions, political agendas, values, and priorities. And I think that usually decision making is made based on a mix of these factors, and sometimes one completely outweighs the others, rightly or wrongly. And sometimes a completely random factor takes priority over all of the others. And this quote from a former MP, I think, really demonstrates the importance of credible evidence and powerful stories, because that's how political arguments are made. So you might be thinking, if it's this messy and complicated, then why bother engaging with policy making at all? And I think I'd go back to my original point, is because good decisions rely on good evidence, and you want good decisions to be made. Unless there's any particularly malevolent participants among you, I think most people want good decisions to be made. But also you're helping to inform democratic debate, including in the public sphere and in the media. You're helping to shape and influence important decisions about policy and law that affect people's lives. It can draw attention to your research and broaden its dissemination, often to new audiences. You can get a new perspective on your work and grow your professional network, and you can learn about how decisions are made firsthand. Now, the policy landscape in Wales is quite complicated, so I thought I'd give you a quick refresher for some of you who might be unfamiliar with this world. So apologies for this very messy slide, but this is me trying to demonstrate in the simplest way that I can that decision-making in the UK is devolved, which means it's shared between the central UK government and Parliament and devolved parliaments and governments. Devolution happened over 20 years ago, and in Wales, it was mainly so decisions were made closer to the people, taking account of the specific Welsh context. And it's constantly evolving as well. And this is Roger's area of expertise, so I'm sure that he'll give you a short lecture if you're interested in finding out more about this afterwards. But it means that in Wales, laws and policies on lots of important issues are decided and implemented by the Welsh Parliament and the Welsh Government. Devolved issues include things like health, education, economic development, housing, and lots more. The remaining non-devolved issues also affect Wales, like most taxes, social security, immigration, and defence. These are decided at a UK level by the UK Parliament and UK Government. The Welsh Parliament, or Senedd Cymru, is the name of the 60 members of the Senedd who are elected every 5 years. The Parliament represents the people of Wales, checks and challenges the work of the Welsh Government through rigorous scrutiny, makes and changes laws for Wales, debates the important issues of the day, and checks and approves government spending, including budgets and devolved taxes. The Welsh Government is the name of a completely separate institution. The government's formed by the party or parties that command the confidence of the Senedd by winning a majority or through coalition. Certain members of the Senedd are chosen to be ministers who go on to run government departments which propose new laws to the Senedd and do the day-to-day running of public services. The government is accountable to the Senedd, which means that ministers have to answer questions each week and committees undertake inquiries into their actions. This scrutiny is critical in a democracy, and this scrutiny has to be based on sound evidence. I think it's also worth pointing out, if it's not already obvious, that the Welsh Government is a lot bigger than the Senedd, as it has to do the day-to-day running of the country. And I think it has over 5,000 employees now. The 60 members of the Senedd are supported by their own support staff and impartial Senedd Commission staff like myself, and there's about 400 others. So hopefully you can see on this slide that each institution serves very different purposes. The Senedd is smaller, it does its work a lot more publicly and involves people with a wide range of opinions. And the government is bigger and has a lot more practical impact. And these are the sorts of considerations that you might want to think about when you're engaging with policy making. And I just wanted to try and illustrate some of the difficulties in negotiating the two worlds between research and policy, because they're very, very different. And sometimes the interface between them is quite challenging. But I'm very, very sure that knowledge, understanding, and good relationships can help people in both worlds overcome these challenges to create good impact and good change. And I think the first thing that I'd like to point out is that politics and decision making often happens much quicker than rigorous peer-reviewed research can be produced. And we sort of saw this quite a lot during COVID, and there was public pressure to act very quickly. So things like access to evidence about what works is really important, and using expertise on a less formal basis are ways of negotiating this. And in the Senedd, we set up a COVID expert register to access experts very, very quickly. And actually tomorrow we're launching the Senedd's first areas of research interest, which is another way of gathering existing evidence and expertise on a less formal basis. Tone of communication is really important as well. Decision makers are really busy and have to make decisions really fast. And in my experience, researchers often want to communicate nuance and caveats, while decision makers want clarity and concision and confidence. Good communication skills and a balance between concision and precision is really, really critical. And learning how to speak to that world is one of the most important things that you can do to engage effectively. And I think as is being honest about the benefits and limitations of evidence. Harmonizing evidence in politics isn't straightforward. And big decisions like whether to impose lockdowns are really a balance of science and personal judgment. And being evidence-led can't fully counter the randomness of outcomes as well. So being clear about known unknowns and unknown unknowns is crucial, as well as communicating these effectively. And I think it's also worth mentioning culture and professional norms. Where the research world values rigor and detailed study by people with deep expertise in their subject, civil servants and politicians often rely on pragmatism, and they're not usually experts. The constantly evolving policy landscape requires them to have a broader and more transferable skill set. And that means that researchers might only have insights for part of what's needed by decision makers. So partnerships and relationships are really important to come together to answer questions. And I think just seeing from the chat, you've all got amazing expertise, and you're all doing really interesting research that has the potential to inform important decisions being made in Wales. Some areas of research are straightforwardly applicable to policy making, but others might think that they're doing something very niche that isn't applicable to policy at all. And I was trying to think of examples of research applications that aren't quite straightforward. And I was working on a prisoner voting inquiry years ago now. And one of the things that the researchers that contributed really interesting insights was an expert in medieval history. And we also had someone who came from a philosophy background and obviously rights. We commissioned research about vaccine hesitancy from the Swansea School of Psychology, which was really powerful. And we also use things like geographic information systems and other types of mapping to map out access to banking or remote working hubs or even hospital driving times. And that's something that's really powerful in a policymaking context. We've also worked with professors of population studies to map out future housing need. And my particular favourite, we had a professor of pop music who did some work for us on the impact of the pandemic on live music. I think it's also reiterating that you all also have a stake in higher education policy making because it directly affects your work and your funding and your lives. So however you're interacting with the policy world, whether it's on something very specific or based on your experiences, you all have a connection to it in some way. So that's my explanation, hopefully, of the interface between these two worlds. But here are some of my practical tips for engaging. And I think the first would be to know your audience and the context that you're targeting. And this means getting to know the policy process and how decisions are being made. And you're already taking the first step on that journey by coming to this seminar today. And it will be different for every policy area. So it's really important to keep up to date with new legislative proposals, new consultations, strategies and political commitments, both at a government level and a parliamentary level, and to plan your research or your engagement accordingly. And just as an example of the things that you can sign up to keep up to date, I run a monthly newsletter targeted at the research community, which summarises all of the opportunities to engage with the Senedd. And there are equivalent newsletters for the UK Parliament as well, and also Scotland's, if you want to spread your research further. And I think also consider what you want to achieve from the outset. Do you want to get your research published? Do you want to enhance your reputation in some way? Do you want to change a law or a policy? Do you have a solution to a problem or the idea for a policy? Each of these aims will need a different pathway. So get advice and figure out the best way of engaging to maximise your impact. You'll have knowledge mobilisers in your universities, and there are people like me in public institutions as well. And I think also consider your role in this process. Do you want to be an advocate or an honest broker of research? Because you can rarely be both, I think. So this balance is both scientific and political, and you can take either path, but it's difficult to get back on the other one. And I know I've said this already, but I'm going to reiterate it now. Make your research readable, because readability is absolutely the most important factor in policy engagement. And the complaint that I hear the most from my colleagues that work with committees or even politicians and their staff is that they can't understand research evidence. It's impenetrable to people outside of that world a lot of the time. So my best tip in this situation is what I tell my colleagues as well, which is to write like a human. Policymakers aren't technical specialists, and they like to read accessible, concise reports. They're also incredibly busy, and they will not have time to read a 50-page report, even if it's on a topic that they're really interested in. Give them what they need up front and be clear about how it helps them in the shortest possible format. And just as an example, this means a 1 or 2 pager with conclusions and recommendations dated with contact details and your name, with links to further information if they're more interested. You don't need to spend days and days and days constructing a very detailed paper. My next tip is being relevant and timing your engagement well. Research is at its most influential when it's politically topical. So, for example, if the Senate's considering a new air quality law and your research is on air quality, make sure that you know what the deadlines are for that legislative scrutiny, because otherwise you'll miss the opportunity for influence. And for example, consultations that are open in the Senate are often open for between sort of 6 and 8 weeks. So keeping up to date with these timings is really important, because you probably won't have that kind of opportunity to influence a brand new law again in that way on that topic. And I think also being accessible to policymakers and engaging frequently is important. And this means building relationships with people in the policy world, building a reputation. So, for example, by attending non-academic conferences, approaching people with ideas, responding to consultations, and signing up to expert registers and roundtables are good ways to do this. And also being creative and applying your research to inform decision making. As I talked about previously, is a sort of entrepreneurial way of engaging. And this means experimenting with different approaches, evaluating them, and being resilient to failure. As I said, we don't live in that straightforward world where you contribute your evidence, everybody listens, and then everybody acts on that evidence. That's not the reality that we're living in. So be resilient to the other factors that come into decision making. And the final one is about doing high quality research. And I think that's obviously obvious, but your success in influencing policy is highly dependent on good research. I just wanted to reiterate that. But it also is worth saying that policymakers might have different ideas to you about quality and relevance of research. So it's worth bearing in mind. And the link that I've put in the slide sets out the realities of policy engagement rather than an idealized version that's often described by people like me. And it's worth a read. It covers whether or not to engage, how to engage, and the purposes of engagement. And I know I've been talking for a while and someone's going to shut me up at one point, but I've got one more thing to do, which is to describe the opportunities for academics to engage specifically with the Senate so that their research can inform democratic debate. And I think committees are the main way for you to have your say on issues being examined by the Senate. Inquiries, legislative scrutiny, budgets, keep up to date with the new ones, and learn how to write effective evidence submissions are my key tips. All written and oral evidence is published online, and it's an excellent way to draw attention to your research and get your name known. As I said before, written evidence doesn't have to be a 20-page study. It can be a couple of pages of insights and recommendations with links to further research. There are also other opportunities like the areas of research interest that we're launching tomorrow. And these give you the opportunity to provide further evidence as well. So an oral evidence, in being invited to give oral evidence in a public committee hearing is probably the most influential opportunity that you can have in that process. It's very, very scary. Roger's disagreeing with me. I think I would not want to do it. But there's support for you to do that if that opportunity arises. And the way to get to that point is also getting your name known, contributing written evidence, and being tapped into what's going on. Senedd Research is the Sened's in-house research service, which I work for. We support all members and committees in all of their roles in an impartial way. We answer questions confidentially, we write briefings for committees, and we publish lots of research for everyone to read on our website. And we use academics to help us support the work of the Senedd through academic fellowships, through research commissions, through expert registers. And we're increasingly offering opportunities for guest articles, and there'll be events hopefully in the future as well. We're also part of the UKRI PhD internship programme, which funds students to work for an influential organisation for 3 months and applications for this scheme open imminently. The date hasn't been confirmed yet, but it will be soon. I think it's also worth mentioning that individual members of the Senedd also have specific interests. They might act as party spokespeople on particular issues or be campaigning on a certain thing. And political parties also use research to create their policies and campaigns. And the Senedd also has other opportunities like events and exhibition space as well. And just to give my newsletter another pitch, the link is on the screen for where you can sign up. I'll drop the link in the chat as well. And these pages also include guidance and training and things like that. You're going to hear some really good case studies in the rest of this session, so I'll finish up there. But I'm happy to take questions, and if anybody disagrees with me about anything, and I'll stop my screen sharing now.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. So thank you, that was really helpful. We have, I think, at least 15 minutes until Hannah needs to leave us. So, and then go on with the business of running the country. So we have some time for questions. If people can either use them in the chat or quite how else I'm going to be able to follow 60 little places, but maybe if people could raise their virtual hands or things like that for any questions, that would be really helpful. Alison Tarrant, if you could unmute Alison and perhaps put your camera on, and the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. I'm sorry, my connection is struggling, so is it okay if I leave my camera off? My apologies for that.
Yeah, sure.
Hannah, that was a really interesting session. Thank you very much. This is something I've been puzzling with for some time. It's not actually entirely connected, but you're probably the best person to answer it. One of the things when I've been working in terms of policy in Wales, one of the things that keeps cropping up, a sense I get, is that the civil service in Wales is what I would describe as underpowered. And by that, I don't mean that the people working in it are not good at their jobs. I mean that just the sheer size of it is not really sufficient for the work that the Welsh government is now doing. And I've been trying to find some kind of comparative figures as to, for example, how many people there might be working on health policy or social care policy in Wales compared to in Whitehall. But I'm really struggling to find those figures. And I just wondered what your view was on that. Is this hunch right? Is it that there is just, you mentioned that civil servants have to have these very broad remits. And it seems to me that back in the past, when I did some work in policy in Westminster, there were opportunities for civil servants to be more focused and to develop their expertise more strongly. And I just wondered if you had any comments on that.
That's such a good question and such a hard question to answer. And those comparative figures are something that I would be very interested in as well. Well, because of my my position, I can't have a view on these things necessarily. Maybe Roger's more in a better place to answer that. So I don't really have an answer for you. I think the issue with devolution is that, especially in Wales, more topics have been devolved to Wales over the years, and in certain areas, I think that resources haven't matched the acquisition of responsibilities, to use a very odd phrase. And I think that, yeah, we see it in different areas, and I think I don't know if that's a byproduct of a fluctuating period of change over the last 20 odd years, and whether that's going to become more stable or whether it's going to just continue. But Roger, what's your take on that, do you think?
I think Alison is basically right, that I think, you talked about several thousand people working for the Welsh government, but if you look at the numbers who are actually working on policy development or implementation in any specific area, often we're actually very quickly getting down to a fairly small number of people who are often having to cover quite a range of ground. So I think it is true that it's often much easier to get through to the people who are shaping policy, I think, at the devolved level than, say, at the UK level. There's also often more need. I'd say actually one other area where there's often, I think, a huge need for ideas and expertise is amongst opposition parties. We tend to concentrate thinking about impact and whatever on governing parties and government machinery, because those are the people who can maybe immediately wield levers of power. But often, certainly if you're trying to influence debates, I think opposition parties are equally worth talking to and probably will be even more keen to listen to you because they have none of the resources really of the civil service. I mean, they basically have themselves and maybe a small number of party staff. So if you're somebody who is interesting and has important ideas and evidence, then often they will be almost comically grateful, actually, has been my experience. Yeah, so anyway, we have a couple of questions, Hannah, in the chat. Could come to them. One from Gillian Powell. Do policymakers, etc., value one type of research evidence more than others? For example, quantitative over qualitative.
I wouldn't say so. I think that if research is of high quality and it's communicated well, I think that policymakers don't go in with a particular value judgment about one over the other, to be honest.
Yeah, sure, thank you. And then Zabaria Andlib, I hope I pronounced that correctly, just asked whether is there a new upcoming call for the academic fellowship scheme?
Yeah, hopefully. We're just reviewing how to approach the new scheme at the moment. So the Knowledge Exchange newsletter is your place to get information about that. I just wanted to go back to your point earlier about the pros and the cons of there being a small number of people working on particular areas. And one of the pros of that is that it is easier to access people. And I just, I'm not having views on things, but when I was working as a researcher in the research service in the Senate, my subject areas were equality, human rights, poverty, social security, immigration, and domestic abuse. And my equivalent in the House of Commons, there was potentially 10 or 12 people working on those topics. So my equivalents, which means that you have a much shallower range of knowledge, especially so much shallower than academic working on these issues. So we rely on people with more expertise to answer these complex questions, to scrutinize legislation. And I think that's, yeah, there are pros and cons of there being very few people involved in these things.
Yeah. And then I guess, Hannah, as and when you find people who are reliable and helpful sources of information on these areas that you're trying to cover, presumably you keep going back to them and have kind of more of a sort of an ongoing relationship with them in terms of ways in which they may be able to help you with your work.
Yeah, I've always tried to when I was a researcher specialising in those areas, I always tried to keep a close network of these experts. But I do think that that's problematic in its own way, because you're going back to the same people and you're hearing the same evidence and the same views. And we're doing quite a lot of work in the Senate at the moment to try and diversify the evidence and diversify the sort of spectrum of research evidence that we get. Because we did some analysis of the written and oral evidence which has contributed to committee inquiries recently, and only between 5 and 10% of the evidence that was contributed was from the research community. So the vast majority is from charities, from public sector organisations, very little from the private sector as well. So it's not to say that there needs to be a target, but it's just to sort of understand where that evidence is coming from and whether it's a good balance.
Sure. Well, and obviously today's event is hopefully helping people develop in terms of their ability to contribute and thereby expanding the potential expertise base that can contribute into policymaking. We have another question that's come in the chat from Minchel Son. Again, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Any insights on city council level? So interested in their policy planning and implementation. Any tips on how we define the boundary of policy making kind of at the level of councils?
I don't know if I'm best placed to answer that, to be honest with you. I'm sure that there are different ways of engaging at a council level. I'm not aware that there are there are programs like knowledge exchange programs at a local authority level, but it might well be my ignorance rather than anything else.
Yeah, I suppose some of those issues of resources may be even more stark at the council level. Of course, then you're talking about areas of responsibility, and I suppose again that those will be different at the council level. So some subject expertises will be maybe most relevant and most useful for local councils, or at least possibly some specific local councils, and others may be more relevant at the devolved level, others at the UK level. Yes. Please, we have a few more minutes if people want to raise questions orally or through the chat. Please do that. I wonder if I could just briefly comment or elaborate further a bit, Hannah, and second, I'll come to you, Chris, on committee evidence, and other people here may have experience of that. You mentioned that you found it fairly scary, and the very first time I ever gave evidence to a parliamentary committee was also scary. I actually didn't sleep very much the night before. But I mean, I'm interested to see your comments, Hannah. My experience has overwhelmingly been that, you know, I mean, unless you like submit written evidence or something which is calling one party a bunch of liars or something really confrontational, that basically committees, they want you for your expertise. They want to learn from you. They're not, it's not going to be like a scene from Witness to the Prosecution where they're interrogating you and cross-examining you. They simply want to learn from you and suck up as much of your knowledge as they possibly can. And actually, they're generally very courteous, and particularly if you're a relatively junior scholar, you know, they really generally actually staff and members go out of their way to be nice to you and to be supportive. And it's actually a lot less scary than you might think it is.
Yeah, I'd completely, I mean, I've never given evidence. I've only ever sat on the other side of the table supporting the chair and members. So maybe it's not fair for me to comment. But I think this idea of parliamentary committees is confrontational, because what you see on the TV is them scrutinising ministers and public officials, whereas there are two different types of evidence sessions. There's the scrutiny sessions and the evidence gathering sessions. The evidence gathering sessions are much less newsworthy, and you don't see them necessarily on the news. And as you say, Roger, they're a lot more comfortable and yeah, nice. But I would say that if you do get the opportunity, because I've had this situation so many times over the last decade or so, where we've invited particularly academics, often women as well, to give oral evidence, and people have refused because they're worried about doing it. But I would emphasise that staff will always support you. We've run practice sessions for organisations that we're looking to do that again in the future, and you know, people like Roger, I'm sure, would give advice on how to get over nerves and to present your evidence in the best way. So there's lots of support out there, even though it is a very public situation. But the step before that is, as I said, learning how to write effective written evidence that gets you an invite.
Sure, thanks, Hannah. Chris, you had your virtual hand raised.
Yeah, thanks. Hannah, I wonder if you could comment on the comparing going through channels sort of officially through the Senedd and sort of kind of cold calling sort of Senedd members, and how those compare.
Yeah, the cold calling thing, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, I can comment from what happens from an official's point of view. So if an academic ever approached me when I was a researcher because I'd written an article or something like that, as long as it's relevant to what's on the political agenda, and that the person that's you know, engaging is tapped into what's going on, it's usually very helpful. But also, it's just really, I think one of the things that we struggle with the most is just knowing what researchers are out there and what they're working on and what their expertise is. So for instance, when a committee is designing an inquiry, let's say, we have a couple of weeks to come up with potential witnesses and to do background briefings, terms of reference and things like that. So it's a really, really short turnaround. And knowing who's out there, knowing in advance who's working on these issues and who might be willing to provide advice or help is so incredibly useful. So it's that relationship building and networking. I have people messaging me all the time to say, here's a policy brief, it's 2 pages about my project. in case it's useful for this particular committee in the future. They're not looking at it now. And it might not result in an immediate outcome, but in a year's time, that committee might be exploring what inquiries they want to do. And I'll have passed that information on to the relevant clerking and research team, so members will consider it. So it's never a straightforward path. And if you're ever nervous about approaching people, I say just do it, because the worst that can happen is someone doesn't respond to your email. And I think that from my perspective anyway, I would never not say thank you, and it all goes into a bank of us knowing who's out there, because we have to identify people really, really quickly.
So thanks. And I think this might have to be the last question just in the chat from Rebecca Amos. What do you feel are some of the current key issues where researchers could effectively contribite? Issues that are timely. So
I could talk for the next hour or so about that. So I'll quickly say that to find out what's topical in the SENEF in particular, there are two ways to do this. So you can look at the 3 weekly timetables of debates that are coming up to see what sort of things are on political agenda. And for individual committees, they often have forward work programs or even strategies that set out what they're interested in over the next few years. And also these areas of research interest that we're starting to pilot tomorrow, some of the topics, the two committees have chosen 4 topics. One of them, the Climate Change Committee, for instance, is looking at behavioural change in response to climate change, modal shift and active travel, and sustainable communities. So those are the sorts of things that they're interested in exploring. They're not very specific, they're just interested in gathering information about people working in that area and the current research in those areas. In terms of the government, you can kind of see what's on their agenda through statements, cabinet statements, but also the legislative agenda and the programme for government over the next 5 years. You can see what's on their agenda as well.
Okay, thanks very much, Hannah. I thought it was absolutely fantastic, and I'm sure we could discuss this a lot further. But I know you have to go off and, as I say, go back to running the country, and we have to move on with our schedule as well. But thank you very much, Jochen Vayan. I'm sure lots of people will find that extremely helpful.
Thanks, Roger. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, we're now going to move on to the second and slightly longer half of your section of our session this morning, where we're talking to Hannah, had in a sense. So as one side of the interaction between the policy world and the research world. We're now going to share the experiences of 3 active, fairly junior researchers who have, in various ways, sought to influence policy or got involved in policy debates with their work. I'm going to, if it's okay with you, Pholisi, Chris, and Nelda, cut my introductions of you really short, because I don't think anyone wants to listen to me introducing you. I think they just want to listen to you and hear what you have to say. So first of all, we'll have Dr. Pholisi Kingsbury, who's a Wizard postdoctoral research associate at Aberystwyth University.
Okay, yes, so hello, I'm Pholisi Kingsbury and I'm a postdoctoral research associate at Aberystwyth University, working in the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences. So research that's linked to policy making, policymakers, is something I've only very relatively recently started doing in the last couple of years. So today I'm really going to be talking about the experience of moving into this kind of research and shifting between different ways of doing things, and what I've learned from the process so far. So this is still very much a learning curve for me. Now, my PhD research was about as far removed from policy as you can get, so I looked at countercultural migration into Wales during the 1960s and 70s. So that's hippies who moved into rural parts of Wales to start small holdings, things like that. And I was focusing on their personal experiences and figuring out how they fit into the wider narrative of events at that time, using oral history interviews combined with primary and secondary literature. And the point of that research was to gain a better understanding of the counterculture itself and the way its members interacted with communities in Wales. And it produced a lot of new insights into things like migration dynamics, how countercultures operate, community relationships within Wales, but my main intention was to share the migrant stories and experiences. So I'm going to be publishing the thesis as a book, which will hopefully continue to further academic understandings of the movement, but I don't really expect it to have a lot of impact beyond that point. And I imagine this experience will be familiar to a lot of PhD students. It's quite common to write a thesis, turn it into a book, and then leave the matter there, step away and do something else. And that is, of course, something very different to the experience of doing policy-linked research. So in terms of the type of research I'm now doing, there's been a big shift, like I said, between my PhD and my postdoc, and this is still a really recent change. So the different dynamics of policy research is something I'm getting used to. I'm now in the middle of working as a postdoctoral research associate with the Civil Society Research Centre at WIZARD, which is the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research and Data. And I'm working across 3 different projects, each of which has a slightly different relationship with policymakers and policy making. So one project focuses on the conflicts in society that arise from increases in populism and political polarisation, and the role of civil society in addressing these conflicts. So my primary work on this project has so far involved analysing newspaper coverage of polarising events, such as protests against second homes or for Black Lives Matter, and interviews with key individuals involved. So as you can see on the surface, that looks pretty similar to my PhD. It's interviews, research with primary data, intended to give an insight into people's experiences. And the same is true of the second project, which looks at systems of patronage in Welsh charities and the power relationships present within them, using social network analysis on the data. The third project on new repertoires and contentions of social mobilisation in the energy transition hasn't properly started yet, but it's again going to be similar methods, social media content, that sort of thing. However, I found that although the methods are the same, the actual experience is what's really different. So there's a whole extra stage of research and a whole extra set of considerations that you need to take into account when doing work that has clear policy implications. So whereas my PhD only had 2 general sets of interests that I had to consider, there were the participants and there was academia itself. If you're intending to engage policymakers, it throws in a whole other group of people who have expectations about your research, and that affects every stage of the process, from planning to writing up. Now, if you're doing a lot of public engagement as part of your research, you might feel more comfortable with that, but it's still going to be an adjustment either way. And I've also found that, perhaps unsurprisingly, there's a lot more time and effort spent thinking about how your research is going to make an impact. And this consideration is more pressing than it might otherwise be. But it also seems to me that although this understanding of impact is not quite the same as the usual academic understanding of impact, although there's some overlap, but they're slightly different. There's an expectation that this research is going to end up delivered in a certain format to certain people by a certain time, but you won't necessarily know all of that unless you're familiar with the processes. And that's something I'm still trying to wrap my head around, even after 2 years. Policy making naturally involves a very different kind of language to academia. There are new terms to get used to, there's a new frame of reference to understand, and that can be quite confusing. You're going to need to learn how to navigate this world alongside the already complicated world of academia, which chances are you've only just got to grips on anyway. But the thing I found helpful to remember is that you've reached the post-PhD stage and you've already managed to get the hang of academia, and you're therefore eminently capable of learning a second set of terms and references. To be honest, academia is about as complicated as it gets, so you're good, you've done it. And then the final difference I've noticed is the jump from sort of very independent and sometimes quite isolating experience of doing a PhD to being part of what is, once you incorporate stakeholders and policymakers, probably quite a large team. For me, this shift was even more pronounced because I had an exceptionally isolated PhD experience. I was working from home due to illness. I didn't really contact anyone besides participants. And I'm now working across multiple projects, multiple teams, dozens of stakeholders. There's a huge number of people involved. But I think everyone will experience this shift in one way or another. And learning to move away from the kind of isolated academic in an ivory tower stereotype and embrace many kind of sets of competing interests and opinions can be quite a big challenge, but it's also it's a fun one, and it's something that's really useful. So I would say there are 4 really important things to remember when you are switching from theoretical research to policy-linked research, or in fact, even if you're just considering the switch. So firstly, policymakers are working in a really different context to you. This is important to wrap your head around, especially if you've had quite an isolated PhD experience, but even if you haven't, it's a whole other set of expectations and pressures that you won't understand, and you need them to guide you on that. And secondly, your research isn't just for you anymore. It may not have been anyway, but a lot of times when you're doing a PhD, you're the one who wants it. But I think there's still quite a big mindset shift to get around anyway. There are people who are expecting things from you and who need this research for various reasons. And if that sounds a bit scary and difficult, then I also want you to remember that chances are, like I said, you've already got most of the skills you need to make this switch. If you're moving into policy-linked research post-PhD, you've already got your doctorate, you've proved your capabilities. This is really not going to be that bad by comparison. And even if you do find there are a few gaps in your knowledge, then my final top tip to remember is that you've done a PhD, you've stuck it through higher education through this long, you're going to be really good at learning new things. Like, if nothing else, you have got the education thing down pat. You can tackle anything. So yeah, that's generally what I have. I hope that's been helpful. I hope you feel a bit more confident now, a bit more able to step into this world. If you want to ask any questions or talk about what I do, you're more than welcome to get in touch with me, either via email or I'm always on Twitter. So yeah, good luck. Take care.
Thanks very much, Flossie. About anybody else, I find myself kind of nodding in agreement a hell of a lot of the time through that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through all 3 of the presentations now, and then we'll have chance for discussion and Q&A. So without any further ado, then we'll move on to Chris Saville, who is a clinical lecturer at Bangor University. So, Chris.
Hey, how's it going? So I'll just try and find my screen. So my plan for my talk is to talk a little bit about a project the funding is finished and I'm attempting to sort of squeeze the last drops of impact out of it and so forth. And then talk a bit about my experience of trying to do impact and policy sort of outreach. So with the sort of, a mixture of success and abject failure. So without further ado. So I'm going to talk a bit about the project called COVID in the Coalfield. So essentially, it's a project looking at vaccine hesitance in coalfield areas of Wales and Appalachia in the United States. So a quick kind of spiel. So essentially, as you can see from this graph is sort of broadly speaking a good thing, I guess. So coal, we need to get off coal, and we seem to be slowly getting off coal. But there is obviously a cost to this as well. So a lot of communities in both Wales and around the world made their living through coal production, and it sort of offered a source of relatively well-paying work for people and a sort of stable source of that. And the sort of the political and social consequences of the loss of this work has been kind of enormous and catastrophic in these communities, and has had real kind of social implications more broadly. So the idea of the project is that coal mining has got a sort of socio-cultural residue. So you've got this history of extractive capitalism, you've got this experience of deindustrialization, and this leads to lower social institutional trust. Obviously, when you're trying to convince lots of people to take a novel vaccine for a novel virus, trust is important. And so I was interested in looking at whether areas with this history of coal mining had higher rates of vaccine hesitance, both kind of attitudinally and behaviourally. Also, we've got these areas often have kind of present day economic challenges. So, so the South Wales valleys, places like East Kentucky and Appalachia. More kind of positively, they've got norms of solidarity, they've got norms of community that might be kind of protective, as the vaccination is kind of a sort of social act, essentially. And I was interested in looking at this in more detail. And I was able to persuade the British Academy to give us some money to do that, which is my first sort of proper success in grant capture. So that was very exciting. So I ran a survey in Wales and the states overlapping with Central Appalachia, and we asked around people's views on COVID, their economic circumstances, whether they're vaccinated or not, their feelings of kind of belonging, community participation, politics, national identity. And then they then discovered sort of a load of money down the back of the sofa, and they gave us some more money to do some qualitative interview. So that was all very exciting. To sort of put it in a nutshell, basically people in both coalfields had more vaccine hesitant views and were generally more skeptical about official narratives about COVID than people who lived off coalfields. And in the US, these attitudes fed through into lower vaccination rates. But in Wales, the vaccination rates remained high, even in coalfield areas, even though there was this kind of latent vaccine hesitance. So we're interested in this, we've got, so I won't go into it in great detail, but we kind of explored throughout the survey and the interviews some of these kind of themes around belonging, social capital, trust, politics, identity, and so on. Anyway, so obviously I think I've got the report link somewhere, but I'll be trying to get some papers out, so I'll try and build some hype on that. So this is obviously a project which is a pressing real world issue, and there does seem to be potential for impact here. So we were keen to try to engage with policymakers, and our funders were as well. So one thing I would say is that the British Academy were very, very good on this, and they so this is another thing to bear in mind if you're doing funded work, looking at what your funders might be able to do for you. But I'm going to try and distill what I've learned trying to accomplish some impact here. So the first thing I think is trying to develop collaborations with practitioners. So one of my co-applicants, Daniel Thomas in Public Health Wales, he's a consultant epidemiologist, and I worked with him previously on a small kind of unfunded project we did, and we were kind of well placed when the grant was announced to collaborate. So the first thing I would say is, before you've even sort of started on sort of projects that you think are going to be core for impact, try to build some relationships and collaborations with people who are kind of practitioners in the field. So not just academics, people who are working in the field. This is a really constructive kind of dynamic, I think. So firstly, Daniel is very, sees things through the eyes of a practitioner. Practitioners really bring the so what question. So academics, we're terribly excited around kind of these kind of elegant and counterintuitive sort of patterns and so on. Practitioners have got a very healthy attitude to something like, okay, so what does this mean? And this is the kind of question that policymakers be asking too. So building practitioners in sort of from the word go and helping them lead the research with you is vital, I think, to avoid us sort of receding into our own navels, essentially, as researchers, which is a problem I have. They also, Daniel and other practitioners like him will have useful contacts, and they'll have kind of credibility with those contacts. So these sort of contacts will help you open doors when it comes to dissemination or and so forth. So yeah, first bit of advice is try to work with practitioners early on. And I think and it's kind of goes back to some of Hannah's advice, I think, which basically is do good quality research. And if you collaborate with practitioners, it will help you shape your research into something that will be useful. And this is the most important thing you can do when it comes to impact, is try and make your research useful in the first place. There's no point trying to kind of have impact with research which is not designed that way. And I think involving stakeholders early is another thing that's important. So we tried, as well as having people like Daniel kind of directly involved as kind of, sort of co-applicants in the research, trying to speak to some stakeholders when you're sort of developing your research. So this is like the kind of, I don't know, the kind of quantitative researchers in the virtual room. There's a sort of meme around kind of like, if you you want to go to see a statistician early, if you just take it to the statistician when you've got the data, they can sort of pronounce the cause of death rather than necessarily help. And this is kind of the case, I think, with stakeholders as well. If you go and talk to stakeholders early, they will they will have an idea about what data you should be collecting, what is interesting. It is really useful going and talking to people who work kind of on the ground about these things, and they can help shape what you should be measuring, what kind of questions to ask, whether this is qualitative or quantitative work. You'll get a lot of insight from that. You'll also build relationships that will be useful later when you're trying to have an impact. So because you have actually listened to them, then A, you'll be more likely to generate things that are useful. B, you will have built this relationship with them, and they will, you will have kind of shown respect to them by listening to them, I think, and that's kind of important in that. It also kind of, if you involve them particularly early, you might even be able to build kind of things more structurally into kind of grant funding so that you can get some money to do some kind of stuff with practitioners, and that might be useful as well. But try to involve, stakeholders more broadly early on. Another thing that I think is interesting around this, so this is kind of a chip on a shoulder kind of thing about working in Wales, is essentially there's an interesting way in which I think Wales and policy in Wales and so forth can be seen as kind of oddly kind of parochial, and a kind of and issues here can be seen as specific and local rather than sort of general, whereas issues sometimes in other areas could be seen as, well, these are the big important issues facing the world at the moment. One kind of interesting way around this that I hadn't quite realized until we sort of started doing it is involving people from abroad kind of buys you credibility. If you've got international visitors, people will be kind of excited. Basically, people will be excited to come and meet the person who's visiting from Kentucky. So we had a public health director come over from Kentucky to Wales, and everyone was very excited to meet him. So you end up in these meetings as well, and you have a chance to kind of, and then when the favour is returned and you visit them, then you then become the exotic kind of international kind of person. So you can kind of act as each other's battering rams for opening doors almost. So there is something kind of that enhances both of your status by virtue of being in an international collaboration. And also, so I was talking to one of my collaborators in Kentucky about this, and she really felt that sort of Appalachia had this experience too, where they're kind of held to this higher standard, where problems in Appalachia are seen as, well, that's a sort of specific rural thing going on there, whereas this problem happening in this big international city represents the kind of the big questions of the age that kind of have no place, essentially. So essentially teaming up with other people like this, so Wales and Appalachia, you can kind of point out, well, this is kind of, coal mining things do sound like a weird placey specific issue, but there are coal fields all over the world. They're quite big. A lot of people live there. They are important. And so borrowing, you kind of end up with sort of more credibility than either of you would have had originally by kind of teaming up. So international credibility, I think, is another kind of tip here. Even if you're trying to have a local impact, having international collaboration can be quite useful in that. So another thing to think about here is finding venues to present. So the major kind of naive pre-planned attempt at dissemination we had, we organised an online webinar, which obviously everyone is thoroughly sick of. Present company accepted. You guys are perhaps self-selected to have a high tolerance for online webinars, but generally, so my collaborators did a very good job here of getting lots of public health people to attend on both sides of the Atlantic. So I mean, I think it went okay, yeah, it went well. I'm doing myself down to it. We had a good day with this, but I think, and my attempts to kind of generally kind of persuade MPs and Senate members to turn up were kind of sort of less successful, I think, than my colleagues' work with public health was. And this was worthwhile, but what I think was more useful is if you can wangle, basically, rather than putting on your own show, trying to kind of get invited to stuff. So Daniel was able to get us to present at the Welsh Government's Vaccine Equity Committee, which I think was a really great opportunity. There were lots of really relevant people there. And our funders, the British Academy, managed to get us a slot to talk to the CDC, so the US's public health agency's vaccine demand group. And generally, I think talking at other people's events seemed like it was more productive than trying to put on your own show. Or I wouldn't recommend against putting on your own show, but I think, finding venues that are kind of pre-existing, that have a kind of pre-existing status to present at, I found very helpful. And again, I would not have managed to get into either of these places. I got into these places essentially by collaborating with the right people, and also our funders, to give them every credit in the world. They were very, very good about trying to find places for people they were funding to present on this, and they were very successful at doing that. So yeah, yes, but by working with people who have the contacts, it's very helpful. But yeah, trying to get to things that are not just your kind of your particular kind of show. The other thing, which I think everyone has kind of already mentioned, but warrants repeating essentially, is that looking for kind of actionable conclusions. So academics, we have kind of, I think, I don't want to say bad instincts, because I think it is in being interested in kind of ideas and some of the patterns we're interested in. I think sometimes that even if they're not actionable, that there is value in those ideas, and we shouldn't stop being interested in that. That is kind of part of the point of academics. But I think policy people and practitioners, their attention is kind of grabbed by different stuff. So we like basically an elegant explanation for some sort of phenomenon. We want something that's kind of, there's a sort of aesthetic quality, I think, to how academics look at data sometimes. Like there is something kind of elegant. Wow, that study was really elegant and came up with a really kind of clever answer. What policy and practice people want to know is like, what shall I do given where we are? Not a sort of like, well, we should go back several hundred years and design the country differently, or we should have deindustrialized South Wales in a different way to how we did. That, that opportunity has passed. What is interesting is, what do we do now? What what is the policy here? What are the actions from this? The so what question that is always helpful about having practitioners around. So don't go beyond your data. So this is a dangerous kind of thing. You don't want to be like, okay, because of my correlational study I've done here, we should definitely go ahead and do this. But do look at things that look that might be actionable. So for example, yeah, like I can't change, suggesting that, well, I think we should, change, we should deal with poverty in the coalfields is kind of like, well, that's a long-standing policy challenge that faces Wales. Reminding people of its importance is good, but they will want some low-hanging fruit for things you can do. Specifically, what kind of things could be done here, and look for things that might be actionable. So yeah, I again have probably flown through my slides. I don't know how long that was, but anyway. So thank you all very much for listening. Diolch yn fawr am wrando, and feel free to get in touch either on email or Twitter if that's at all useful. Thank you very much to my colleagues who, as I said, were, it is important to work with the right people when you're trying to impact stuff. And my colleagues are very good at this. And also thank you to all our participants who put up with our, sort of social science surveys and so on, and the interviews, the people who did the survey work, and the funders who can extra job that. If you are at all interested, we've got a report, short form report on the British Academy's website. I don't think the slides will be circulated, but there is a hyperlink anyway. So thank you very much.
Great, diolch yn fawr iawn, Chris. Another fascinating presentation. Again, I found that nodding a great deal in agreement.
Very encouraging when we're talking to us nodding in the background. So
we'll now move to the final one of these three sort of case studies. And so Dr. Melda Lewis Griffiths, who is Senior Public Health Research Officer at Public Health Wales and also the National Centre for Population Health and Wellbeing Research. So the floor is yours.
Hello, right. Can you see my slides? Is everything okay? Good stuff. Okay. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I had some technical issues earlier. It's good to actually be in the room. So today I'll talk through some of my experiences during the still very early years of my research career, and some of the things that I would highlight as being valuable if I could talk to me back at the start of pursuing this bonkers journey through research. A lot of what I'll discuss will be sort of discussed within the context of the different stages of where I've been. So I thought I'd start by just quickly showing you where I've been along the way. So my background is in psychology, and I've always been drawn to research with practical applications, particularly relating to health. The perfect PhD opportunity came along. It was an ESRC project with involvement from Public Health Wales and the Yned Bevan University Health Board. And it involved applying psychology to dietary interventions, including one that was formed around an existing directive on hospital vending machines and healthy vending. So this was a very collaborative project that involved working really closely with a lot of partners from the offset. And I think that was a really good foundational experience to help me learn how to apply research in a very collaborative way. I was given the opportunity to present some of my findings at a conference. Through networking there, I met someone from Public Health Wales, and through that got an ESSE placement at Public Health Wales during the PhD. That gave me a really good opportunity to understand the differences in the ways of working between academia and practice and policy, and a flavour of some of the policy developments happening at the time that had relevance to my work. I ultimately ended up going back to Public Health Wales after my PhD. So in my current role, I do research that explores the links between employment and health, sort of feeding into the evidence base around that, and aiming hopefully to sort of produce evidence that's useful for policymakers. So it's quite an exciting crossover between academia and practice. I'm still at the very early stages of my research career, but I've been fortunate enough to have a few experiences doing research that has relevance to policy and practice. I'm still learning, but I've compiled some of my key reflections on things that have served me well along the way, or things that I've observed from my colleagues as examples of good practice. So I'll talk you through some sort of take-home messages that I would give to younger me about what is useful in working in this space. The first would be to sort of seek out projects where policymakers and practitioners are involved from the early stages. So this has been discussed already by Chris and others on the call. It was clear to me from when I first saw the PhD opportunity that it would hold the potential to have impact for policy and practice. There was involvement from external partners who worked closely with policymakers, and the primary intervention was developed to improve the evidence base for an intervention already applied and for a chief medical officer directive that was already in place. I didn't really intentionally seek out a PhD of this kind, but now with the benefit of hindsight, I can see that it offered a really good foundation for me to develop the research skills necessary to start generating evidence that had relevance to practice. It offered a platform for me to develop my ability to communicate with different partners, learn how to reframe my ideas dependent on the audience and so on, and offered an insight into sort of stakeholder expectations, and really threw me in at the deep end of trying to balance my needs as a researcher, so whether I needed to randomize the intervention, the need for sort of reliable data collection, and then that of our partners. So the idea of randomization was quite fun to explain to the sort of vending machine providers who just wanted to sell stuff in the vending machines in their interventions. A key strength of the project, I think, was the fact that these partners were involved from the outset. While it did mean that some of our research questions were constrained to those most applicable to policy and practice, it also meant that we weren't wasting our efforts exploring research questions that just wouldn't produce usable answers. I think that being involved in that project helped me grow as a researcher, and I'd really encourage other early career researchers to seek out or even create opportunities to be involved in those kind of collaborative projects, be that as your PhD studentship, like me, or as a placement during it, as a sort of specific collaboration for a specific chapter in a thesis, or just for your first sort of postdoc role. The second thing I'd say is that getting an insider's perspective is really, really beneficial. So although my PhD tested an intervention that was being applied in practice, and there was policy around it, it was during my placement at Public Health Wales that I really started reflecting on where my research sat within the policy landscape. Taking time out from the PhD to learn about the processes and ways of working outside of academia, specifically within a context where the outputs of our work was being applied, was really invaluable. It gave me the opportunity to see the ways in which policymakers and practitioners work collaboratively, and crucially, how they interact with the kind of evidence that we as academics produce. My placement involved an element of good timing as well. A Welsh Government strategy with direct relevance to the topic of my PhD was in development, the Healthy Weight, Healthy Wales strategy. And so that meant I was able to get a behind the scenes look at what went into that strategy development. And not only that, it gave me a flavour of what the key policy priorities would be for the years to come, which allowed me to reflect on how my PhD research sort of sat in that space and could contribute to the evidence base needed. So yeah, I'd really encourage anyone who can take a step away from the PhD for a while to widen their perspectives to take up these kind of opportunities. This message seems kind of obvious, but keeping informed on latest policy developments and trying to foresee upcoming evidence needs is really key if you want to generate research that's useful for policymakers. Knowing what topics are taking priority and getting a feel of the evidence gaps helps ensure that your research is applicable in the long run. I've learned a lot about this in my current role, largely from observing the good practice of my colleagues. So I joined the team sort of after a big survey had been done across Wales during the pandemic. And I've learned a lot from the sort of way that this survey was approached, both in terms of the design and its dissemination. So for example, in response to the Welsh Government's employability plan and the report of the Fair Work Commission, my colleague Ben built the survey to explore some of the key emerging themes there. So around secure work, fairly paid work, having sort of permanent contracts and the need for fair work in Wales. Research from elsewhere had highlighted that there were associations between precarious employment and ill health. So Ben set out to build the evidence base on precarious employment in Wales with a view to contribute to the knowledge base with relevance to that employment policy landscape in Wales. So he's not only been able to generate knowledge that helps us understand the bwynt in Wales, but understand its links to health and crucially highlight the need for more data. So since doing this work and generating that evidence, we've both had the opportunity to go into sort of working groups with Welsh Government on fair work, health and productivity to share our findings and really advocate for the need for embedding measures of precarious employment into routinely collected data in Wales. So we're still advocating for that, still working on it, but we're hoping that sort of our aim or our vision would be to have a measure of precarious employment within the National Survey for Wales. So that's something we've been discussing with Welsh Government and hoping to take forward. Another example from that survey was the fact that sort of quick adaptation of its design meant that we were able to generate evidence that had relevance to changes in the policy landscape and societal changes. So the survey was originally intended as an exploration of precarious employment, but due to its timing, it was being developed just as the pandemic kicked in. And so some quick reviewing of it meant that some questions around the changes to employment that people experienced during the pandemic, excuse me, we were able to embed that within the survey and ask some really insightful questions right at the right time about the changes that we were seeing in society. So a lot of my work is focused on the shift to home working and the impacts on health from that. So the sort of quick adaptation and response to that allowed us to generate really meaningful insights in that space. And I'm in the process of compiling an evidence briefing that highlights the sort of key messages from that at the moment. So it's quite exciting to work on something that has relevance to sort of new policy developments, because we've just seen earlier in the year there was a remote working strategy that was released in Wales called Smarter Working. So it's quite exciting to be generating work that's right on the money in that space. My fourth message would be to be empathetic when collaborating. Policymakers is often used as a catch-all term, but in every project, each stakeholder will be approaching it with a unique perspective. Those involved in strategic development and those involved in implementation, for example, might want really different things from being involved in your research project. So taking the time to understand these nuances will pay dividends. Investing your time getting an understanding of the motivations and needs of your partners will help you reframe your communications. Instead of talking at each other like these people in the cartoon, spend time listening to each other's perspectives and understanding them. Be open to having a two-way conversation. Doing that will more than likely boost the practical applicability of your work. So it's a really mutually beneficial process. I think some of the key questions that I would ask you, I would encourage you to ask yourself at the start of a new collaborative working relationship would be, why is this stakeholder involved? What are they hoping to gain from their involvement? What are the key outcomes of interest for that stakeholder? And how do these compare with my own? And understanding that right at the very beginning will help set you up for success. My last message is about how you communicate your findings. So making your findings as accessible as possible for whoever ends up being its end user will improve our chances for impact. In the same way that the research outputs we do can be presented in different ways. So we're used to doing research articles, and we're used to learning how to do conference posters and so on as we learn to be academics. We have to think about the ways in which policymakers use our evidence and communicate it in ways that play to these needs. My placement at Public Health Wales gave me an appreciation of the different timescales in academia and practice, and how this trickles down to shape how people interact with evidence. For example, while doing my PhD, I may have had a week to explore the literature on the specific method for one experiment. As Hannah said, in policy and practice, being able to gather the key points in as little time as possible without compromising our understanding of what can and can't be claimed from a piece of research is really important in the policy and practice space. In Public Health Wales, one way that we tackle this is by publishing our work in different formats. So as I said, I'm working on an evidence briefing on home working. So that's sort of alongside writing a research paper, presenting at conferences. We've been really honing in on what are the key findings from this piece of work. How can we present that in an accessible format, and placing it in the right context for policymakers as they read through it. These briefings are typically much more snappy, focused, and they directly discuss the things that are of relevance for policymakers. I think as well, it's sometimes just emailing through your paper as it is might not be as effective as maybe taking an extra bit of time to reframe your messages and present it in a really accessible way for policymakers. Giving them a taste of the findings in that way could then maybe lead to them being intrigued and having the appetite to seek out the original work as well. That being said, being open to sharing our work in these slightly different ways means accepting some hard truths. So if you want your research to be useful to policymakers, we do have to invest our time making sure they're accessible. So that does mean doing more work. And it also means working at a faster pace, because the longer you leave it, since sort of from the day you finish data collection, that data starts getting stale in the sort of policy perspective and practice perspective. So good project management is key, and good sort of placement of your work in the right context as you present it. Another caveat is, particularly for me, I'm working in a sort of practitioner space. If you're working outside of academia, there's extra levels of sign-off that your work may need to pass through, that your sort of the messages you put out there need to be signed off by different levels of management, so that you probably will need to build that time into your project planning as well. So while there's definitely challenges to adapting our communications, it does ultimately mean that policymakers see your findings in a much more focused, tailor-made format that aligns with their ways of working, making it much more accessible and much more usable as well. Some other thoughts on sort of communication. I think I've been trying, I haven't got many followers, but building a following of policy influencers on social media can pay off. So sort of make use of the affiliations that you have. So the tweet on the left there is from the Centre for Population Health. There's a really good comms team there that helped me out a lot. So presenting your work in accessible ways. This was a sort of interactive video infographic kind of thing. You know, boosts the engagement with your work. You can even share it at really early stages. So I did a kind of thread on the key findings from a preprint on Twitter, and I don't even know if that's a lot of impressions on Twitter, but you know, it's much more than it would have been if I would have waited until the whole review process was over to start creating traction on my work. That being said, promoting through these sort of external channels can be hit and miss. So I think also directly engaging with policymakers has the great potential, if it's done well, So targeted dissemination, finding the right people to send it to as well in the right format can pay off. Lastly, so communicating to policymakers, in my view, shouldn't be seen solely as an end goal. Keeping an open conversation throughout the research process can really boost the potential for impact and improve the applicability of your work. So investing in those relationships is crucial. I think where I'm placed in Public Health Wales, and with the sort of academic side support from the National Centre, it means that I'm at a nice crossover between policy, practice and academia. And, you know, a lot of the sort of hard work of making those connections is done just from being in that organisation. But so I think it really helps you see the value of what those connections make. So really investing in creating those connections is key, I think. So just to repeat, the sort of take-home messages that I would share would be to seek out projects with policymakers and practitioners involved from the early stages, get an insider's perspective, keep informed on latest policy developments and try to see what might come next, be empathetic when collaborating and be adaptable when communicating your findings. And that's it from me. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much for your time.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Imelda. Thanks indeed to all three of you for presenting there. We seem to have kept pretty well to time. Wondered then if I could just go back to our three speakers. So Pholisi, Christopher and Melda. Obviously we've heard lots of interesting stuff already today, but I wonder maybe like kind of you've given us really useful things about what to do and whatever. Maybe one thing like not to do. One like key thing you've learned from your mistakes. Anyone who's tried to interact in the policy sphere has made lots of mistakes. I've made hundreds probably. You don't have to necessarily share embarrassing incidents. So maybe one thing you've learned like not to do or not to expect or not to try or something like that, or maybe a sort of lesson like that. Chris, maybe yourself up? I
think so. One thing I think this is sort of vaguely is I suppose sort of not to kind of think impact is going to be a sort of easy, straightforward thing to kind of sort of fit into the cracks. I think if you want to do impact, you need to kind of budget time for it, and you need to persuade people who are managing you that this is something that is worth doing, that needs time. So I think the risk sometimes can be sort of like, I don't know, like if you're going to present, to like, I don't know, like Senedd, or you're going to present less fancily, you're going to go and present to some group, you're going to need to spend time to write that. You also often, you're going to need to prepare it, the actual time to deliver it. It ends up taking kind of potentially quite a lot of time. You need to sort of speculate to accumulate a bit. You need to spend time, working, developing relationships. I think it is something that if you're going to do, you don't want to sort of treat it as a kind of an afterthought, and that you need to kind of commit to it a bit, and you need to make sure everyone, particularly people who are in charge of you, are aware of it, that's something that is going to take time. So that's a sort of a positive way of framing it, but yeah, so there's a don't concealed in there, I think.
Yeah, no. So thanks very much, Chris, and that. I said I would heartily agree. This is not something to be done as an afterthought. Very much. Pholisi, any kind of thoughts on kind of like things not to do, things to avoid, and whatever?
Well, something that just came up in the breakout room was the fact that, and I didn't think to mention this in the paper, but the project that we started out with when we put in the funding is very different to the project that we're doing now, and that's because the needs have changed. The funding was put in 2016. World has changed significantly since 2016, and we've had to respond to that. So I would say don't go into it thinking the thing that you signed up for at the beginning is absolutely going to be the thing that you end up doing at the end, because it probably won't be, and you can't be too like fixated on the thing that you wanted at the start, the way you are with a PhD. It's you've got to be very responsive, I think to put a positive frame on it, the way Chris did. Yeah.
Good. Great, thanks very much. And Melda, any last lessons from you?
Yeah, I'm still trying to think of a positive frame for mine. So
be negative if you want.
No, just don't assume that people are going to like all of your research ideas. So I think during the placement, I had the opportunity to talk to some people in Welsh Government about sort of how to shape my placement and the work I would be doing there, and discuss some of my PhD as well. And you know, I was really enthusiastic about that opportunity, and I talked about all the things I wanted to do in my PhD, but they really wanted me to focus in on, okay, what can I do now, and what of what I'm doing is directly relevant to what we're going to be doing, and that kind of thing. So just being sort of, again, it's about framing and knowing what to say at when is the right time to advocate for a certain piece of work, and who is the right audience for the right piece of research. I know my supervisor loved my wacky research ideas, but the people working in policy maybe wanted the much more practical stuff. So yeah, that would be my tip. Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, Melda. Because the converse of that can be sometimes ideas that you think are of fairly marginal importance sometimes seem of much greater importance to policymakers or people outside academia. Okay, it's very nearly time to wrap up. I'd just like to leave colleagues just with one thought, certainly based on my significant experience on sort of public engagement, as well as I think transmitting lessons from your research and whatever, and informing public debate. One other benefit that I've certainly found is that you can also actually learn a hell of a lot. There are in many walks of life relevant to many fields of academic research, there are some really incredibly bright people out there who aren't actually working in academia. And I've some of the cleverest people I've come across in fields related to my research are actually not active academics working in the area. Sometimes they're people who just study this stuff as a hobby or are practically involved in some way. And you might end up learning as well as transmitting learning a lot more than you think. So there can be that potential benefit as well. Anyway, we've more or less run out of time. I'd like to conclude by thanking a group of people, also thanking principally Kathy and Barbara for organising today's events and doing all the legwork and technical stuff that makes sure an event like this runs smoothly. I'd like to thank Hannah, our first speaker, although she can't actually be, she's not with us right now, but I thought she gave an excellent start to the event. And I'd like to thank Pholisi, Chris and Melda for sharing so generously your experiences, which I think, I was scribbling loads of notes down here. So I hope the others on this Zoom session have learned every bit as much as I have. So it's now dinner time here in Hong Kong. I guess it's late morning for you there in Wales, or wherever most of you are. So anyway, diolch yn fawr iawn for everyone for joining us. Thanks to the speakers, thanks to the organisers. I hope all of you have found this useful and engaging. And with that, we'll conclude.